Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. The sky above St. Mary Mead was clear, save for a few drifting clouds, as Miss Marple's taxi wound its way up the gravel drive towards Summerlee House. The manor stood at the top of a gentle rise, its once proud facade showing the unmistakable marks of time. Ivy crept across its stone face, and the windows, though cleaned, seemed to carry the weight of years gone by. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the slightly overgrown borders and the fading polish on the brass doorknocker. To the untrained eye they were mere signs of neglect, but to Miss Marple they hinted at a household that had once thrived and now lived in the shadow of its own past. The housekeeper, Mrs. Draycott, opened the door, her expression one of forced cheer. Miss Marple accepted the greeting with a gentle smile, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. The stiffness in the woman's posture, the nervous glance toward the parlor door, and the faint scent of lavender, masking something far less pleasant. As she stepped inside, Miss Marple felt it at once. That peculiar hush, the kind that lives in houses where secrets linger, waiting for the wrong step, the wrong question, to bring them all tumbling out. The parlor at Summerlee was comfortably old-fashioned, filled with mismatched furniture that spoke of long ownership and short funds. Lady Frobisher, seated at the center of the gathering, wore her eccentricity like a favorite shawl. Bright silk scarves, too many rings, and a laugh just a little too loud for the hour. Beside her, her niece Alice perched on the edge of her chair, her tone sharp enough to cut through the polite conversation. There was a hardness to Alice, a woman too young to be bitter but too old to believe life owed her anything better. Mrs. Draycott stood by the sideboard, her hands folded tightly before her, offering refills of tea with the efficiency of someone who knew every secret that had ever passed these walls, and kept most of them buried. Notably absent was Julian Frobisher, the estranged son whose name flickered like a draft under the door. Mentioned only in whispers, and quickly changed subject. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and unthreatening manner, listened rather than spoke, her knitting needles clacking softly in her lap. Every remark, every strained laugh, every moment of silence told her something. Not always about what was said, but about what everyone chose not to say. It was a household that had once lived brightly, but now held itself together with habit and secrets, like an old quilt where the stitching frayed but no one dared pull the thread. It was Lady Frobisher herself who mentioned the parlor cabinet, with the air of someone introducing an old companion. A fine piece, oak and mahogany, tucked into a corner beside the window. "A wedding gift," she said, waving a jeweled hand. "My first marriage, though one rarely speaks of it." The silence that followed was too carefully placed, like a step avoided on a creaking stair. Alice's mouth tightened, and Mrs. Draycott busied herself with the tea tray. It was Julian's father, the first husband, who had given Lady Frobisher the cabinet, a man who, according to village memory, had died suddenly, under circumstances best left unexamined. There was talk of a maid, too. Edith, her name had been, vanished one evening and never seen again. The village had always whispered, but houses like Summerlee were expert at forgetting the inconvenient. Miss Marple, fingers still knitting, said nothing at all, though her gaze drifted to the cabinet's doors, polished to a shine but with a peculiar gap at one corner, as if something had once been forced inside. Alice, with the casual bravado of someone determined to prove her indifference, moved to the cabinet and ran her fingers along the carved edges. "Ugly thing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "But solid, I suppose." It was the lower panel she touched, her corner where the wood didn't quite sit flush. With the faintest click, the hidden compartment slid open, revealing a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed with age. For a moment, no one spoke. The envelope lay there, innocent and damning all at once, the kind of object that didn't just appear without reason. Mrs. Draycott's hands trembled ever so slightly, and Lady Frobisher's smile faltered. Miss Marple leaned forward, peering at the envelope as if seeing a familiar face in a crowd. Old paper held old truths, and Summerlee, it seemed, had no shortage of those. The envelope passed from hand to hand, each touch hesitant, as though fearing what might lie inside. No one opened it, and no one suggested they should. In the silence that followed, Miss Marple felt the weight of secrets pressing against the room's faded wallpaper. Every household has its shadows, but at Summerlee the shadows had teeth. She folded her knitting, her fingers unusually still. Whatever lay inside that envelope, it was a story unfinished, one that had begun long before today, but which, Miss Marple knew, would soon come tumbling out, whether anyone was ready or not. Evening settled over Summerlee House with the kind of hush that does not soothe, but unsettles. Lamps glowed faintly in the hall, their light too weak to chase away the sense that something had shifted since tea. The discovery of the envelope hung over the house like a curtain caught in a draught, barely moving, yet impossible to ignore. Miss Marple, comfortably seated in the small guest room set aside for her, set her knitting aside. She had counted 3 separate footsteps passing her door since the household retired, none of them purposeful, none of them relaxed. Below, the murmur of voices, hushed and sharp, drifted up the staircase. Someone had lingered in the parlor long after the others, and Miss Marple was quite certain it was not to admire the china. Even through the veil of respectability, she could sense it. The way silence stretched itself too thin, the way hands trembled just slightly when setting down a cup. Summerlee was a house accustomed to holding its breath, but tonight it was holding far more than that. The sound came sharp and sudden, a cry, cut off as though someone had tried to catch it before it escaped. Miss Marple had risen even before the second noise followed, the unmistakable thud of a body meeting wood. By the time she reached the landing, the household was already stirring, doors creaking open, nightclothes rustling. At the foot of the stairs lay Lady Frobisher, a pale silk robe pulled around her like spilled milk. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half open in confusion, her hand curled weakly, as though grasping for something that had slipped through her fingers. Mrs. Draycott was first to kneel beside her, but her face was a shade too pale, her fingers hesitant as they touched her mistress's wrist. Alice appeared seconds later, sharp voice already demanding answers that no one seemed to have. Colonel Whitaker stood back, hands clasped behind him, gaze fixed not on Lady Frobisher, but on the parlor door, left slightly ajar. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply watched. While the others fluttered about with smelling salts and whispered questions, Miss Marple slipped quietly into the parlor. The cabinet stood as it had before, unremarkable in its corner, its wood polished to a dull sheen. But the compartment Alice had opened that afternoon now lay empty. The envelope, with its fragile paper and faded ink, was gone. Miss Marple's fingers trailed lightly over the wood, pausing just where the secret compartment had clicked open. The dust here had been disturbed twice now, once by Alice's innocent curiosity, and once by hands far less innocent. She glanced toward the window. The curtain had been drawn unevenly, leaving a narrow gap through which someone might have stood watching the house. Or perhaps, she thought, someone inside the house had stood there, watching the cabinet instead. She returned to the hallway just as Lady Frobisher was being carried to her room. Miss Marple's expression was mild, her hands folded neatly, but her mind was already moving. If the envelope had vanished so swiftly, it was no ordinary secret it contained. The household gathered in the drawing room, none of them quite knowing why, only that it seemed the sort of thing one did after such an incident. Tea was brought, untouched by all but Miss Marple. Alice stood near the mantelpiece, arms folded so tightly her knuckles whitened. Mrs. Draycott stood apart, her gaze fixed firmly on her shoes, fingers twisting at the edge of her apron. Julian, who had not been seen since the afternoon, hovered awkwardly by the window, too casual to be sincere. Colonel Whitaker settled into a chair with deliberate ease, his usual joviality replaced by an alert stillness, as though weighing the room itself for signs of danger. Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded over her knitting bag, watching. When people are startled, she knew, they wear their secrets poorly. Fear leaves fingerprints on the face, guilt trembles in the voice, and regret lingers in the glance. She did not need questions to see it. The guilt was already in the room. It only needed to decide which shape to take. As the silence stretched, the cracks began to show. Alice, unable to contain herself, spoke first. Sharp remarks about inheritances and debts Lady Frobisher had refused to clear. There was bitterness in her voice, not fresh anger, but something long festering. Mrs. Draycott, trembling slightly, insisted Lady Frobisher's health had been delicate for weeks, her words so eager they felt rehearsed. Julian said little, but his sudden appearance after years abroad required no explanation. Everyone in the room knew that people rarely return home for reasons they care to admit. Colonel Whitaker spoke only once, offering some benign comment about how quickly accidents could happen on steep staircases. Yet his eyes flicked toward the cabinet with such frequency that even Miss Marple found herself counting. It was a room full of people who knew too much and said too little, each one tied to Summerlee by bonds that had frayed and knotted over time. And at the center of it all lay a vanished envelope, holding secrets none of them wished to remember. But none of them could afford to forget. When the room had emptied and silence crept back into the house, Miss Marple withdrew to her room. There was no doubt now. The fall, the missing envelope, the unease in every glance. They were not separate threads, but part of the same dark tapestry. She unrolled her knitting once more, though her mind had already started weaving something far more intricate. Chapter 3. Whispers and Wineglasses. Morning at Summerlee had an uneasy quiet about it, the sort that settles over a house when everyone is pretending nothing has happened. Breakfast was served, though little of it was eaten, and the usual civilities clattered awkwardly against the edges of conversation. Alice buttered her toast with unnecessary vigor, her knife scraping the plate. Mrs. Draycott poured tea with hands held too tightly to the pot, while Colonel Whitaker fussed unnecessarily over his newspaper, a man far too interested in avoiding the room itself. Miss Marple took it all in, the unnatural brightness of forced politeness, the smiles that failed to reach the eyes, the silence that grew heavier whenever footsteps sounded in the hall. The previous night's disturbance lay thick in the air. No one spoke of Lady Frobisher's fall directly, but the absence of her voice at the head of the table was louder than any remark could have been. Secrets were a kind of currency in houses like this, Miss Marple knew. And this morning, everyone at the table was spending theirs with great care. It was Alice, brittle and sharp-edged, who broke the silence first. "I suppose," she said, her voice too light. "This will be expensive. The doctor, I mean." Mrs. Draycott made a vague noise of disapproval, but Alice pressed on, her tone laced with something closer to resentment than concern. "Lady Frobisher's always been so careful with money. Well, her money at any rate. Not quite so generous when it came to anyone else's." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. She had heard this tone before, the bitterness of a woman denied, sharpened over time into something altogether harder. As the conversation meandered, Alice's complaints spilled out. Debts, small at first but steadily mounting. A failed investment. A jeweler's bill that refused to disappear. All of it offered with careless frankness, though the color in her cheeks betrayed a different truth. Lady Frobisher, it seemed, had made her position clear months ago. No more handouts. Alice was to stand on her own feet. It was hardly enough for murder, Miss Marple thought quietly. But it was the kind of motive that makes people desperate, and desperation had a habit of finding opportunity. The conversation shifted when Julian appeared, his arrival as unexpected as it was awkward. He stood in the doorway a moment too long, as though uncertain whether to step forward or retreat. "Julian," Alice said, her voice flat with surprise. "You're back." "Just for a little while," he said, but his glance towards Mrs. Draycott was swift and uneasy. "Thought I should, well, be here." He sat, folding himself into the chair with the stiff discomfort of a man who had been gone too long, and found himself no longer certain where he fit. Miss Marple watched him carefully, the way his fingers drummed once on the tablecloth, the way his gaze lingered on the cabinet, before he caught himself and looked away. Julian's return was no coincidence. People do not reappear after years abroad because of sentiment alone. There was always something. A letter received, a whisper overheard, a debt to be paid or collected. Whatever had drawn Julian back to Summerley, Miss Marple suspected it had very little to do with concern for his mother, and far more to do with whatever lay inside that missing envelope. Throughout it all, Mrs. Draycott hovered, always near the parlor cabinet, always finding some excuse to tidy or adjust or simply stand too close to it. Miss Marple had seen that sort of guarding presence before, in women who had tied their own fate too tightly to someone else's secret. The housekeeper's loyalty to Lady Frobisher was unquestioned, but it was the kind of loyalty that knew too much. Even as Julian spoke, Mrs. Draycott's hand smoothed the cabinet's top, fingers lingering on the wood, as if reassuring herself that nothing more would slip free. When Miss Marple quietly asked about the cabinet's history, Mrs. Draycott's reply was swift and uncharacteristically sharp. "It's nothing special, ma'am. Just an old thing. Too much fuss made over it already." The lie was clumsy, and Mrs. Draycott's eyes never quite met Miss Marple's. But no further question was needed. The housekeeper had just told her everything, without saying a word. After breakfast, Miss Marple lingered near the back stairs, where gossip flows freely among those who sweep and serve. A young maid, still red-cheeked from the morning's tension, whispered that she had overheard a quarrel the night before. Lady Frobisher arguing with a man. The voice had been muffled, the words unclear, but the tone had been unmistakable. anger mixed with fear, the kind of exchange that only happens when old grievances rise to the surface. The maid couldn't say whether it was Julian or Colonel Whitaker, but her certainty that it was one of them was absolute. Miss Marple offered a gentle word of thanks and returned to her knitting. It was not the quarrel itself that interested her, but the fear beneath it. Someone, it seemed, had far more to lose than their place in the household. It was Colonel Whitaker who offered the morning's final clue. As Miss Marple passed the drawing-room, she heard him mutter, half to himself, half to no one at all, "Some secrets are better left buried." He caught sight of her in the doorway, gave a thin smile, and said no more. Miss Marple returned the smile with her usual warmth, but her mind sharpened. In her experience, secrets do not stay buried. They only wait for the right hand to uncover them, sometimes quite by accident. Subtly, she thought, was running out of time. Chapter 4. The cabinets passed. The bell above the shop door gave a cheerful jingle, though the room beyond felt anything but cheerful. Miss Marple stepped inside with her usual gentle air, hands clasped around her handbag, eyes moving lightly across shelves crowded with things once treasured and now forgotten. Mr. Catamol emerged from the back room, his smile polite but distracted. Trade had been slow, and the only visitors these days seemed to be tourists with no appreciation for history. Miss Marple, however, was never a tourist, and her interest in the parlor cabinet was framed with such innocent curiosity that Mr. Catamol relaxed at once. "Fine piece," he said, his fingers brushing a line of dust from an ormolu clock. "Good wood, solid craftsmanship. They don't make them like that anymore." Miss Marple agreed, her question softly placed, as though nothing more than idle conversation over tea. When had the cabinet arrived at Summerley? Was it always considered a valuable piece, and was there, purely for her own curiosity, anything unusual in its history? Mr. Catamol, who enjoyed nothing more than a well-placed story, was only too happy to oblige. The cabinet had arrived at Summerley nearly 30 years ago, Mr. Catamol explained, purchased shortly after the sudden death of Lady Frobisher's first husband. The timing had always struck him as curious, not least because Lady Frobisher had appeared at the shop herself, asking after a very particular piece of furniture. She knew exactly what she wanted, he said, didn't even haggle, which was unlike her. The cabinet was unremarkable to most, but Lady Frobisher had handled it with a certain familiarity, fingers tracing its edges as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. She had it sent to Summerley the very next day, giving no explanation and asking none. Miss Marple, still smiling softly, tucked that detail away. Furniture, she knew, rarely traveled alone. It came with stories, attachments, and sometimes with secrets too heavy to leave behind. It was curious, she thought, that Lady Frobisher had sought out that particular piece so soon after the untimely end of a husband whose name no one spoke easily. Curious, and perhaps no coincidence at all. But it was the cabinet's history before Summerley that interested Miss Marple most, and here Mr. Catamol leaned in, lowering his voice to the confidential murmur of a man who knew when gossip was worth the telling. The cabinet, it seemed, had belonged to a family known locally for their troubles, a well-respected household at first, but clouded by a disappearance that had never been resolved. A maid named Edith, young, clever, and too pretty for her own good, had vanished one night without her coat or wages, leaving behind only rumors of a secret romance and a cabinet she had once claimed as her own treasure. There had been talk, of course. Servants always talk, but no one ever found a body or proof of wrongdoing. The family left the village soon after, selling what they could, including the cabinet. And with it, they left behind a whisper that still clung to its wood like dust. Mr. Catamol shook his head. Bad luck, that piece. Should have burned it, if you ask me. Miss Marple's smile flickered, faint but knowing. Furniture, after all, does not whisper, but houses remember. And so do the people who stay behind. For all its craftsmanship, the cabinet sold cheaply. Almost too cheaply for a piece of such obvious quality. People didn't want it, Mr. Catamol admitted. Said it was unlucky. Furniture with a story like that doesn't sit easy. Miss Marple understood the sentiment well enough. In villages like this, stories settle into wood and stone. A missing girl, a sudden death, a cabinet too grand for its surroundings, lingering like a guest who had outstayed their welcome. But Lady Frobisher had taken it all the same, ignoring warnings and paying more than she needed to. The haste with which it left the shop had struck Mr. Catamol as odd, but no one asks too many questions when money changes hands. Miss Marple murmured something polite, but her mind was already moving ahead, knitting together the fragments of past and present. If Lady Frobisher had welcomed trouble into her home, she had done so with open arms and open eyes. There are bargains, Miss Marple thought, that always come due. On the walk back to Summerley, Miss Marple's pace was unhurried, her mind anything but. The past had a habit of keeping its own account, and no amount of polite silence could erase the weight of what people chose to forget. She had seen it before, in villages no different from this one. Objects outlasted owners, and secrets outlived those who had tried to bury them. The cabinet had stood silently for years, holding its story like a locked drawer. But secrets are never content to stay hidden. They shift, they stir, and eventually they find their way into the light. Miss Marple's fingers worked at the clasp of her handbag, thoughtful and precise. What the dead leave behind, she knew, is rarely as quiet as the living might wish. At the door, just as she was leaving, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to an old ledger, left open on the counter. Mr. Catamol's careful record of sales, marked in his own unfussy script. And there it was, a faint scratch beside the cabinet's entry, almost invisible unless you knew to look. Not a mark made by the dealer's pen, but something sharper, something more deliberate. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply smiled her gentle smile, and made her way back up the lane, already certain that the cabinet's story was far from over. Chapter 5. A Death in the Family. The news spread through Summerley with the peculiar hush that only comes with death. Lady Frobisher had been found lifeless in her bed, her hands folded over the quilt, as though she had simply slipped away in her sleep. The official word was heart failure, and those gathered at breakfast spoke of her passing with appropriate solemnity. Yet Miss Marple, quietly buttering her toast, found herself wondering. Grief hung oddly in the air, not quite natural, not quite genuine. Mrs. Draycott's expression, though suitably stricken, lacked the shattered edges of true loss. Alice paced, but her mourning was too restless, her gaze darting toward the hallway at every sound. Colonel Whitaker, meanwhile, wore the stiff dignity of a man who had seen death before, and meant to see it handled tidily. Julian stood apart, his silence a shade too convenient, as though he had stepped into the role of grieving son, without ever truly occupying it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes soft behind her spectacles. Grief is often sincere, but at Summerley, it felt more like a performance quickly assembled. When the others withdrew, Miss Marple took a quiet turn through Lady Frobisher's room, a gentle request made under the pretext of offering assistance with the morning arrangements. The bedside table was a portrait of quiet chaos, a glass half filled with water, smudged with fingerprints, alongside an empty pill vial left lying on its side. The sort of details one might overlook in genuine grief. But to Miss Marple, they stood out like ink, spilled on lace. The glass had been held by uncertain hands, fingers pressing too firmly against the rim. The pill vial, once full of heart medication, was now conspicuously empty. It was not the careful tidiness of a woman preparing for bed, but the hurried evidence of someone who had meant to cover their tracks, and failed. Death by heart failure was believable enough, but this was no gentle passing. This was a scene touched too many times, not by sorrow, but by fear. Miss Marple folded her hands and stepped back into the hall. The truth, she suspected, lay in what had been taken, and in what had been left behind. The servants gathered like birds on a wire, heads bent together, voices dropping the moment anyone passed. It was from them, those who observe and are rarely observed, that the next piece of the puzzle emerged. Alice, it seemed, had been heard in argument with Lady Frobisher the night before. Sharp words had passed between them, the sort that leave bruises without touch. Something about money, or rather, the refusal of it. Miss Marple listened to the account with her usual gentle nods, absorbing not just the words, but the tone. The maid telling the story was eager, too eager. Gossip often distorts the shape of truth, twisting events to fit a narrative already preferred. Alice, with her sharp tongue and visible frustrations, made an easy villain. Yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that truth rarely chooses the most obvious path. Quarrels over money are common enough in families, but quarrels that end in death, those are rarely so simple. Alice's temper, already stretched thin, snapped under questioning. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" she exclaimed, slamming down her teacup hard enough to rattle the saucers. "Yes, we argued. Yes, I needed money. That doesn't mean I would never—" The sentence broke apart before it could finish, and her hands trembled at her sides. Julian said nothing to defend her, and Colonel Whitaker merely raised a brow, the sort of judgment that carries more weight in silence than words could ever achieve. Mrs. Draycott, standing at the back of the room, offered no defense at all. Alice's desperation was undeniable, debts piling faster than she could pay them, an inheritance increasingly out of reach. She was, by all appearances, the perfect suspect, angry, desperate, and present at the scene. Miss Marple watched her closely. Anger, she knew, could fuel rash decisions. But there was something too tidy about how suspicion had settled on Alice's shoulders, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Later, when the room had emptied and the household dissolved into scattered silences, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The needles moved steadily, her mind moving faster. The scene beside the bed, with its smudged glass and empty vial, troubled her. It was too careless, as if someone had wanted it to be discovered, or more curiously, had assumed no one would look closely enough to care. The envelope, too, was still unaccounted for, a household full of secrets, and the one tangible link to them conveniently vanished. No, Miss Marple thought, this was not the work of a panicked niece with debts. This was something older, deeper, the kind of crime that started long before the first blow fell. Suspicion had been handed to Alice like a poorly wrapped gift. But gifts, Miss Marple knew, were not always given in good faith. Of all the faces at breakfast, only Mrs. Draycart was missing. The housekeeper, so fiercely present at every moment of Lady Frobisher's life, had vanished into her duties with suspicious efficiency. Miss Marple found that absence far more revealing than any argument or outburst. Grief does not make the loyal retreat, unless grief comes tangled with guilt. Mrs. Draycart, it seemed, had found herself somewhere between duty and self-preservation, and Miss Marple could not help but wonder which instinct would win. The parlor cabinet stood silent in its corner, unguarded for the first time since Miss Marple's arrival, and like a house left unlocked, it invited further exploration. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and made her way to the parlor, her step gentle, but her intent anything but. Chapter 6. The Maid's Vanishing. The village had a long memory, particularly for stories that were never quite allowed to end. Miss Marple knew this well, which was why she made her way to the greengrocer's, the post office, and the baker's in turn, her conversation as light as air, but her ears keen for anything that lingered beneath the surface. Edith, the maid who vanished. Even after all these years, the name still carried weight, a story often told but never fully explained. A pretty girl, they said, too pretty for her position. There had been whispers of favoritism, of private moments with the late Mr. Frobisher, and then, quite suddenly, she was gone. One maid recalled a quarrel the day before, Lady Frobisher's voice sharp as a blade, Edith's tearful reply cut short by a slammed door. There were rumors of a letter, too, something Edith had received and then hidden. What it contained, no one knew. What Miss Marple did know, as the scraps of gossip wove themselves into a familiar shape, was that Edith's story had never belonged solely to Edith. It had belonged to Summerlee, and to the secrets hidden within its walls. It was at the post office that Miss Marple heard the final thread, the part no one had thought to question at the time. Edith's most cherished possession had been the parlor cabinet. She had spoken of it often, polishing it with more care than the silver, running her fingers along the carved edges as if they held something private and precious. When Edith vanished, the cabinet remained, left behind as though she had meant to return. And then, not long after, Lady Frobisher purchased it herself from the same household Edith had served. No one questioned it. Furniture moved on just as servants did. But to Miss Marple, it was too neat a coincidence, too deliberately arranged. Lady Frobisher had not merely bought out a cabinet. She had claimed a piece of Edith's life. It was more than sentiment, Miss Marple suspected. It was possession, and perhaps even protection. A desire to keep something close, or to keep something hidden. Miss Marple's fingers stilled against the clasp of her handbag. If Edith's secrets were still tucked inside that cabinet, it was no wonder someone had been so anxious to make it disappear. That evening, with the house unusually quiet, Miss Marple returned to the parlor and knelt beside the cabinet, her touch as gentle as memory itself. Her fingers found the hidden compartment easily. Secrets tend to remember where they belong. But it was not empty. Pressed into the corner, nearly lost to time, was a torn page, the edges brittle, the ink faint, but legible. It was Edith's hand, a diary entry, hurried and uneven, written on the very night she disappeared. The words trembled across the page. "Someone is watching me." A fear half-formed, but unmistakable. She mentioned a voice outside her window, a shadow she had glimpsed through the curtains, a feeling that every step she took was being followed. The page ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted, or worse, as if she had no chance to finish. Miss Marple folded the fragile page carefully. The past, it seemed, was not a ghost to be banished, but a voice that had waited patiently to be heard. Miss Marple sat in the parlor long after the house had settled into sleep, the torn page resting in her lap. The cabinet stood beside her, mute and unapologetic, as if its role had been to hold the truth all along. Edith's fears had not been imagination. Someone had followed her. Someone had ensured she would never tell what she knew. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that even after all these years, the story could not be told. What struck Miss Marple most was the silence, the way the cabinet had simply stood, year after year, holding its secret with the patience only wood and guilt can possess. It had stood through the second marriage, the quiet decline of Summerlee, and now the death of Lady Frobisher herself. But silence, Miss Marple knew, is never truly silent. It leaks into the cracks, into the cautious glances of housekeepers, into the brittle temper of nieces, and into the sudden return of prodigal sons. The cabinet had been a witness, but it was Miss Marple who would ensure it finally spoke. As Miss Marple prepared for bed, her mind arranged the pieces with the precision of a seamstress matching patterns. Edith's disappearance, the cabinet's journey, the missing envelope, and Lady Frobisher's fear. They were not separate strands, but a single thread, knotted tightly around a secret someone had killed to keep. The envelope, too, was part of it. Edith's final voice, perhaps, preserved on paper. If someone had risked so much to hide it, Miss Marple could only conclude that it held not just a confession, but a truth, so dangerous it could unravel everything. Tomorrow, she thought, would be a day for quiet conversation and carefully chosen questions. Chapter 7. The Envelope's Return. The summons came mid-morning, delivered by a slightly breathless telegram boy, who seemed unsure whether to treat the message as serious or absurd. The envelope had turned up in the lost property box at the village post office. No explanation, no witness to its arrival. It was simply there, as if deposited by an invisible hand. Miss Marple accepted the news with her usual gentle composure, though inwardly her mind stirred like a spoon turning sugar into tea. Items do not vanish and reappear of their own accord, particularly not items burdened with secrets. Someone had placed it there, and not with the intention of returning it to its rightful owner, but with the hope it would be found. At the post office, the envelope lay on the counter, its edges more creased than before, as though it had passed through more hands than anyone would admit. Miss Marple picked it up, her fingers light but thoughtful, feeling the weight of what it might contain. There are moments, she knew, when the past does not merely knock, it forces the door wide open. The letter inside bore Edith's hand, her writing both familiar and trembling, as though the words themselves had cost her dearly to set down. The paper was thin, the ink faded, but the message was clear enough. She had seen it with her own eyes, a quiet poisoning at Summerlee House, not an act of violence, but something slower, more deliberate. A powder added to a glass, a hand that trembled only once before it steadied. The victim had been Lady Frobisher's first husband, and Edith had stood in the doorway, too stunned to speak, watching death take hold before the glass was even set down. The letter spoke not of why, only of what. There was fear in every line, fear of the secret itself, but also fear of the consequences. Edith had not known what to do, whether to speak or to hold her silence, And it seemed, in the end, silence had been forced upon her. Miss Marple read the letter twice. Confessions rarely appear so conveniently, especially not when they arrive too late to save or condemn. The truth, she suspected, was far less tidy than the letter wished her to believe. What unsettled Miss Marple most was the implication buried between the lines. Edith's letter did not name names, but it spoke of a female hand, one familiar enough to pass unnoticed in the household, one whose presence at the bedside would have raised no suspicion at all. The village memory, when stirred, had a sharp tongue and a long reach. Alice's mother, dear departed Margaret, had been Lady Frobisher's closest companion in those days, her constant presence at Summerley. The connection was too neat, the suggestion too clear. Already whispers had begun to thread their way through the village. Her daughter paying for her mother's sins, a legacy of poison passed from one generation to the next. Miss Marple had always mistrusted convenient explanations, particularly when they arrived wrapped in such suspiciously perfect packaging. The tragedy of Summerley, it seemed, was not just a tale of money and inheritance, but something older. A debt left unpaid between women who had once called each other friend. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. It was, perhaps, too good a clue to be trusted. It was only as Miss Marple prepared to return the letter to its envelope that her eye caught something. A hesitation in the stroke of a letter, a slight wavering in the hand. Most would not have noticed it, but Miss Marple's life had been long, and her attention to such small betrayals was second nature. The handwriting, though clearly meant to match Edith's, bore an unevenness not present in the earlier diary page found in the cabinet. It was a forgery, but one done by someone who had known Edith well enough to nearly succeed. Nearly, but not quite. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the paper again, thoughtful. Whoever had crafted this letter had known exactly what they wanted her to believe. It was not a confession, but a performance, a carefully rehearsed lie designed to fit a story that was already half believed. Someone was leading her by the hand, hoping she would follow the wrong path to its convenient conclusion. And that, more than the poisoning itself, was what troubled her most. As she walked back toward Summerley, the letter folded neatly inside her handbag, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh. The past was never so obliging as to write down its sins and place them neatly in a post-office box. The truth, she knew, was often a much untidier thing, one hidden not in letters, but in the actions people cannot quite conceal. Someone had written this letter. Someone still alive, still watching, still fearful. And in trying so hard to direct suspicion elsewhere, they had left behind the faintest trace of their own hand. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her pace unhurried. The truth was no longer buried. It had been dug up and placed on display. But like a poorly staged play, it had shown too much of the scenery. All that remained was to pull back the curtain. Chapter 8. Tea, Treachery, and Truth. The invitation was framed as nothing more than a neighborly gesture, the kind of polite affair one hosts to soften the edges of grief. Miss Marple, of course, had other intentions entirely. Tea at Summerley was not a condolence visit. It was a carefully laid trap, wrapped in china cups and polite conversation. Alice arrived first, her irritation barely masked behind forced pleasantries. Julian followed, reluctant as ever, his manner that of a man who had wandered into a room already against him. Mrs. Draycott appeared last, her apron too neat, her hands folded too tightly in her lap, as though holding herself together by force alone. Miss Marple, smiling her usual gentle smile, poured tea with steady hands, her conversation light and meaningless, until, in a tone almost too casual, she mentioned the envelope's sudden reappearance at the post office. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. No one asked how it had come to be there, nor who might have placed it. In fact, no one spoke at all. Suspicion, it seemed, had already taken each guest by the hand. It was Mrs. Draycott who broke first. One hand trembled against the edge of the table, her spoon slipping from her fingers to land with a soft, damp clink against the saucer. A heartbeat later, her face drained of color, her body stiffened, and then, quite suddenly, she fainted. The others stirred, startled into action, but Miss Marple did not rise. She simply watched, her knitting needles resting beside her plate, her expression as mild as if they had been discussing the weather. There are fainting fits caused by shock, Miss Marple knew, but this was not one of them. This was guilt pressing down too heavily, the weight of a truth that could no longer be ignored. When Mrs. Draycott came round, her eyes darted immediately to Miss Marple, as if searching for a sign. Had she given too much away? Had anyone noticed? Miss Marple offered only a soft word about the heat of the room, but privately she understood. Mrs. Draycott's collapse had not been caused by grief or surprise, but by the knowledge that a truth buried for decades was now dangerously close to the surface. Alice, however, was not the sort to faint or to hold her tongue. The moment Mrs. Draycott had been revived, Alice launched into a tirade that seemed too ready, too rehearsed. "Oh, for God's sake, what is it now?" she demanded. "What does it matter about some ancient envelope? If you're trying to pin all this on me, well, I'm sick to death of it." Her voice rose with each word, her face flushed, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing holding her upright. No one had accused her. Not yet. But Alice behaved like a woman already under trial, her guilt assumed, and her defense prepared long before the charge had been laid. Miss Marple said nothing, only offered her another cup of tea, the gesture so calm it felt almost cruel against Alice's agitation. It was a curious thing, Miss Marple thought. Not that Alice was defensive, but what she was defending herself against. No one had mentioned her name in connection to the letter, yet she had placed herself at the center of suspicion without invitation. Sometimes guilt needs no accusation. It leaps forward to meet its own shadow. If Alice's fury was loud, Julian's reaction was quieter, but no less revealing. He had barely touched his tea, and at the first mention of the letter, his hand froze halfway to his mouth. Moments later he rose abruptly, offering a clumsy excuse about a telegram he had forgotten to send. No one believed it, least of all Miss Marple, who merely inclined her head in mild acceptance. Julian left the room with the hasty tread of a man walking away from danger rather than toward responsibility. His return to Summerlee had always felt ill-timed, but now Miss Marple understood. He had not come back out of duty or affection, but because the past had summoned him, and he had hoped, somehow, to contain it. But secrets once disturbed are rarely polite enough to stay contained. They seep into the floorboards, into the air between polite conversation, until the only options left are to confess, or to run. Julian, it seemed, had chosen the latter, and in doing so, he had told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. As the tea grew cold and the tension grew warmer, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, deliberate remark. "The tea has a rather unusual taste today," she said lightly. "Almost bitter, wouldn't you say?" No one replied, but Mrs. Draycott's hand trembled anew, Alice's jaw clenched, and Julian, halfway out the door, paused just for a moment too long. Poison was not a word that needed to be spoken aloud. Its history lived in the walls, in the whispered fate of Lady Frobisher's first husband, and perhaps, Miss Marple suspected, in the fate of poor Edith as well. The past, it seemed, had left its signature behind, and someone, perhaps more than one someone, had been living in its shadow ever since. Chapter 9. The final clue in the cabinet. The house lay in a restless hush, the kind of silence that follows when too much has been said, and yet not enough. Miss Marple sat quietly in the parlor, her knitting untouched in her lap, her gaze drifting once more to the cabinet in the corner. It had been present from the very beginning, quiet, unassuming, yet somehow always at the center of the room's attention. A piece of furniture with far too much history to be simply decorative. Miss Marple rose, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood, as though greeting an old friend who had not yet told her the whole story. There was something left, something waiting to be found, though what or why remained just out of reach. She opened the cabinet door, careful hands brushing over each shelf, each compartment. Objects outlive their owners, she knew. But sometimes they also outlive their secrets, hiding them not from the world, but from those who know where to look. And Miss Marple had always known where to look. It was a faint unevenness beneath her fingertips, a whisper of movement no ordinary eye would catch. The back panel of the cabinet shifted ever so slightly, no more than the thickness of a hair, but enough. Miss Marple pressed gently, and the wood gave way. A narrow slit appeared, and from it, a crumpled scrap of paper fell into her waiting hand. Age had not been kind to it, the edges brittle, the ink smudged. But the meaning was clear enough. This was no simple letter, hastily written and forgotten. This was a note deliberately hidden, tucked away not to be found easily, but to remain silent unless someone truly knew what to seek. The handwriting was familiar, though shakier than before. Edith's hand, a message written not for posterity, but for survival. Something had frightened her enough to write it down. But more than that, something had frightened her enough to hide it, as though the act of hiding it might somehow keep her safe. It hadn't. Miss Marple smoothed the paper, her heart heavy with the quiet knowledge that Edith had known the truth would catch up with her, one way or another. The note's message was short but devastating. Edith had seen everything. The poisoning of Lady Frobisher's first husband, the glass passed from hand to hand, the faint tremor before it was set down at his bedside. She had known too much, and worse, she had let it slip, perhaps in a careless word or a too trusting moment. From that point on, her fate was sealed. She had been poisoned herself, not with a violent hand, but with the same careful touch of powder into her evening tea. She had felt it too, the dizziness, the sickness. But by the time she understood, it was too late to escape. The note was her final act, a desperate attempt to leave behind the truth, if not for justice, then at least for remembrance. Miss Marple folded the paper with quiet reverence. Edith had died not because of what she had done, but because of what she had seen, and because, in houses like Summerley, the walls are never thick enough to keep secrets truly safe. The note's final line was scrawled in a hand already failing, the letters uneven, almost desperate to outrun the poison overtaking her. They buried me in the orchard. Miss Marple sat back, the weight of it settling into her chest. Edith had never run away, as the village had once whispered. She had never left in disgrace or eloped with a sweetheart. She had been buried quietly, beneath the very trees that Lady Frobisher's guests once admired for their blossom. The house had kept her secret, roots tangling over bones, years of sun and frost, hiding a crime no one had dared confess. It was no wonder Lady Frobisher had kept the cabinet so close. It was no wonder Mrs. Draycott had guarded it like a watchful mother. The truth had been inside all along, wrapped in wood and memory. But secrets, Miss Marple knew, are like seeds. Left too long in the dark, they grow into something far more difficult to contain. Miss Marple sat alone for some time after, the cabinet door still slightly ajar, the note resting beside her. There had been so many deceptions, layer upon layer, Edith's death covered by her own disappearance, a poisoning buried beneath a quiet funeral, a truth hidden inside a harmless cabinet. And yet, as with all such things, the past had been waiting patiently, knowing its time would come. Mrs. Draycott, with her fierce loyalty, Lady Frobisher, with her silent fear, Julian, with his sudden return. All of them had known, in some way, that the truth had never really gone away. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly. The story at last was ready to be told, and those who had waited for so long, both the guilty and the innocent, would have no choice but to listen. Chapter 10. The Truth Unveiled. The parlor felt smaller than usual, the air itself drawn tight around the assembled guests. Alice perched stiffly on the edge of her chair. Julian stood by the mantelpiece, his hands clasped behind his back, and Mrs. Draycott remained near the door, her posture too upright, as though bracing for something she could no longer prevent. Miss Marple sat comfortably, her knitting resting beside her, her expression mild. Yet in her eyes there was a quiet certainty, the sort that unnerves the guilty far more than any accusation ever could. "I believe," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but unyielding, "that the time has come to explain precisely what happened at Summerley, both now and all those years ago." No one spoke. They didn't need to. Each had been waiting for this moment, some with dread, some with desperate hope. The house itself seemed to listen, its walls holding the weight of secrets too long contained. And as Miss Marple began to weave the story together, no one could quite decide whether they wanted to hear it or stop it before it was too late. "It began," Miss Marple said softly, "with loyalty." All eyes turned toward Mrs. Draycott, whose hands twisted the corner of her apron with trembling force. "Loyalty can be a fine thing," Miss Marple continued, "but when it is misplaced it can become a most dangerous motive indeed." She spoke of the first Mr. Frobisher, a man whose charm had worn thin behind closed doors, a man who had not been kind to his wife, a man whose cruelties Mrs. Draycott had witnessed too many times, her loyalty to Lady Frobisher sharpening into something darker, a quiet fury in defense of the woman she served. One night it had gone too far, and Mrs. Draycott, in her fierce devotion, had slipped a fatal dose into his brandy. Not for money, not for inheritance, simply for protection. Or so she had told herself. "It was not planned," Miss Marple said, "but once the line was crossed, there was no going back." Mrs. Draycott's breath came in shallow bursts, her head bowed under the weight of a secret she had carried alone for 30 years. "Loyalty," Miss Marple said again, "can kill as easily as hate. But you see," Miss Marple went on, "the trouble with secrets is that they rarely belong to just one person." Edith, the young maid, had seen what she was not meant to see. A glass passed from hand to hand, the hesitation that lasted just a moment too long, and the silent agreement that followed. She had seen too much, and though Edith had no desire to betray her mistress, fear made her careless. A word overheard, a nervous glance caught at the wrong moment, and Mrs. Draycott understood that Edith could never be trusted to keep silent forever. "Poison," Miss Marple said softly, "was used again. A smaller dose slipped into Edith's evening tea. Not enough for instant death, but enough to make her too weak to resist. When the time came, Mrs. Draycott ensured that Edith vanished, her body placed beneath the old orchard. Her burial no one would question, because no one would think to look." Mrs. Draycott's head fell into her hands. "I only meant to protect her," she whispered. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "But protection, Mrs. Draycott, is not the same as silence bought with death." Miss Marple's gaze shifted, resting softly on the empty chair where Lady Frobisher should have been. "She knew," Miss Marple said simply. "All these years, she knew. Perhaps not at first, perhaps not until the whispers grew too loud, until Mrs. Draycott's devotion began to feel less comforting and more suffocating. But Lady Frobisher had known enough. She had known why her husband died, and she had known why Edith disappeared. And still she had said nothing. Fear had held her tongue, fear of scandal, fear of losing the woman who had always stood by her, and perhaps even fear of her own complicity. After all, silence can make accomplices of us all. But then the letter appeared, a relic from the past that threatened to drag everything back into the light. And when the envelope was found, Mrs. Draycott had acted again, pushing Lady Frobisher down the stairs in a desperate bid to silence the only living witness. "It was not just loyalty," Miss Marple said. "It was fear, and fear, when given time to fester, can turn even the gentlest heart into something truly terrible." The parlor remained silent, the air thick with the weight of truth, finally spoken aloud. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her voice softer now, as though the story itself had taken some toll upon her too. "It is always the smallest decisions," she said, "that lead to the greatest tragedies. A loyal servant protects her mistress. A frightened maid says a word too many. A frightened mistress chooses silence when the truth might have saved them all." She let the words settle. No one moved. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "the house remembers. The furniture remembers. Even the orchard remembers." There was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction in the solving of the crime. Only a gentle sorrow, the kind that comes from knowing that every choice made in fear had led, inevitably, to this very moment. Mrs. Draycott's hands lay still now. The trembling finally stopped, because the burden she had carried alone had at last been shared. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, her fingers finding their familiar rhythm. Secrets, she knew, would always find their way to the surface. And when they did, it was not the discovery that mattered, but the courage to face what had been hidden. The parlor clock struck the hour. Outside the orchard stood silent once more, and at Summerley, the past was finally laid to rest. After all the lies, betrayals, and carefully buried secrets at Summerley House, one truth stands clear. It is not always hatred that drives people to commit unthinkable acts. Sometimes it is love twisted into fear, loyalty stretched too far, and silence bought at far too high a price. Miss Marple has always known this simple fact. No crime happens in isolation. Behind every poisoning, every cover-up, every sudden disappearance, lies a human heart, afraid, desperate, or too loyal to let go. And in the end, it is not just the guilty who pay the price. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.